In the summer of 1943, as Allied forces fought their way across Sicily in the first major invasion of Axis territory in Europe, one of the most controversial incidents of World War II erupted into public scandal. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. 7th Army, had slapped two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in separate incidents at field hospitals, calling them cowards and threatening to have them shot. When news of these incidents leaked to the press months later, public outrage in America was immediate and intense. Congressmen demanded Patton's court-martial. Newspaper editorials called for his removal from command. Many senior American generals, including some who had never liked Patton's flamboyant style and aggressive personality, saw an opportunity to be rid of a troublesome subordinate. But in this moment of crisis, when Patton's career hung by a thread, an unexpected voice spoke in his defense. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, privately but firmly supported keeping Patton in command. Churchill's backing, conveyed through diplomatic channels and in private conversations with American leaders, played a crucial role in saving Patton's career, at a moment when it seemed destined to end in disgrace. The question is why? Why would Churchill, who had his own difficult generals to manage, and who was often at odds with American military strategy, go out of his way to protect an American general who had committed acts that violated basic military discipline and human decency? The answer reveals much about Churchill's strategic thinking, his understanding of military leadership, and his pragmatic approach to winning the war. To understand Churchill's position on Patton, we must first understand the context of the slapping incidents and the crisis they created. In August 1943, Patton was at the height of his powers as a combat commander. His 7th Army had landed in Sicily alongside British forces under Montgomery, and had conducted a brilliant campaign across the island. Patton's aggressive leadership and his army's rapid advance had captured the imagination of the American public, and had established him as one of America's most celebrated generals. But Patton's personality, always volatile, was under enormous strain. He was frustrated by what he saw as Montgomery's caution, and by command decisions that he believed favored British operations over American ones. He was exhausted from the intensity of combat operations, and he was dealing with his own complicated views about courage, duty, and what constituted acceptable behavior for soldiers. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. There he encountered Private Charles Cool, who had been admitted for combat exhaustion. Patton, believing that combat fatigue was cowardice and that soldiers claiming such symptoms were malingering, became enraged. He slapped Cool, called him a coward, and ordered him back to the front lines. A week later, on August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital and encountered Private Paul Bennett, also suffering from combat stress. Patton's reaction was even more extreme. He slapped Bennett twice, threatened to shoot him, and drew his pistol, though he did not actually fire it. Medical personnel at both hospitals were shocked and outraged by Patton's behavior. News of these incidents reached General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, within days. Eisenhower was faced with an impossible dilemma. Patton had just successfully commanded American forces in their first major European campaign. His aggressive leadership had been instrumental in the Sicily victory. The invasion of mainland Italy was being planned, and eventually the invasion of France, operations for which Eisenhower believed Patton's talents would be crucial. But Patton had also committed serious violations of military law and basic human decency. If the incidents became public, there would be enormous pressure to court-martial Patton and remove him from command. Eisenhower's initial response was to handle the matter quietly. He sent Patton a severe letter of reprimand and ordered him to apologize personally to the soldiers he had slapped, to the medical personnel who witnessed the incidents, and to the divisions under his command. Patton complied, though his apologies were grudging, and he privately maintained that he had been right to confront what he saw as cowardice. Eisenhower hoped that this would be the end of the matter, that the incidents could be kept from public knowledge, and that Patton could continue in command. However, in November 1943, journalist Drew Pearson broke the story in a radio broadcast. The American public's reaction was immediate and furious. Many Americans were outraged that a general had assaulted soldiers suffering from combat stress, a condition that was increasingly recognized as a legitimate medical issue rather than cowardice. Newspapers across the country ran editorials demanding Patton's removal. Members of Congress called for investigations and court-martial proceedings. The scandal threatened not only Patton's career, but also Eisenhower's judgment for having protected him. It was in this context, with Patton's career in serious jeopardy, and with many American military and political leaders calling for his removal, that Churchill's support became significant. Churchill had been following the Sicily campaign closely and had been impressed by Patton's performance. He had met Patton on several occasions and had formed his own assessment of the American general's capabilities and character. When the slapping scandal broke, Churchill was asked by American officials for his views on whether Patton should be retained in command despite the controversy. Churchill's response, conveyed through diplomatic channels and in private conversations with President Roosevelt and with American military leaders, was unequivocal. Patton should be retained. Churchill argued that Patton was too valuable as a combat commander to lose over an incident that, while regrettable, did not diminish his military capabilities. Churchill pointed out that Britain had its own difficult generals, that managing talented but flawed commanders was part of the challenge of coalition warfare, and that winning the war required making pragmatic decisions about personnel, even when those decisions were politically uncomfortable. Churchill's support for Patton was not based on personal friendship or on any particular affection for the American general. Churchill found Patton's personality somewhat ridiculous, his theatricality excessive, and his political views often wrong-headed. But Churchill was a pragmatist who understood that war required using the tools available, even when those tools were imperfect. He had dealt with difficult British commanders throughout his career, had protected some and removed others based on calculations about their military value versus the problems they created. In Patton's case, Churchill calculated that his military value far exceeded the problems caused by the slapping incidents. Churchill's reasoning was based on several factors. First, he recognized that the invasion of France, scheduled for 1944, would be the decisive operation of the war in Europe. Success would require aggressive commanders who could break through German defenses and exploit breakthroughs rapidly. Churchill believed that Patton was uniquely suited for this role, that his aggressive instincts and his ability to inspire rapid advances were exactly what would be needed. Losing Patton over the slapping incidents would deprive the Allies of one of their most effective offensive commanders at a crucial moment. Second, Churchill understood that the slapping incidents, while serious, were not indicative of broader command failures. Patton had not lost battles due to incompetence. He had not gotten his men killed unnecessarily through poor planning or execution. He had not committed war crimes or violated the laws of war in his conduct of operations. His offense was personal misconduct toward individual soldiers, serious certainly, but not something that called into question his ability to command in combat. Churchill distinguished between personal failings and professional incompetence, and in Patton's case, he saw the former, but not the latter. Third, Churchill was concerned about the broader implications of removing Patton under public pressure. He believed that military decisions should be made by military leaders based on military considerations, not by politicians responding to public opinion. If Patton were removed because of newspaper editorials and congressional pressure, it would set a precedent that Churchill found troubling. It would suggest that commanders could be removed not for military failures, but for political controversies, which Churchill believed would undermine military effectiveness and command authority. Fourth, Churchill had his own experiences with managing difficult military personalities and understood the challenges Eisenhower faced. Churchill had protected Field Marshal Montgomery, despite Montgomery's difficult personality, his tendency toward insubordination, and his constant conflicts with American commanders. Churchill had defended other British generals who had created political problems or personal scandals. He recognized that Eisenhower was facing similar challenges with Patton, and believed that supporting Eisenhower's decision to retain Patton was important for maintaining the principle that commanders should be judged primarily on their military performance. Churchill conveyed these views through multiple channels. He spoke with Roosevelt directly, arguing that Patton should be retained despite the controversy. He communicated with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, emphasizing Patton's military value. He spoke with American military leaders visiting London, including General George Marshall, making clear that Britain supported keeping Patton in command. And he instructed British representatives in Washington to convey Britain's position to relevant American officials. Churchill's support was particularly significant because it provided political cover for Roosevelt and for American military leaders who wanted to retain Patton but faced domestic political pressure to remove him. Churchill's backing allowed them to argue that the decision to keep Patton was not just an American judgment, but reflected Allied consensus about military necessity. It suggested that Britain, which had been fighting longer and had more experience with the challenges of coalition warfare, believed Patton was too valuable to lose. However, Churchill's support for Patton was not unconditional or uncritical. In his communications with American leaders, Churchill acknowledged that Patton's behavior had been unacceptable and that discipline was necessary. He supported Eisenhower's decision to reprimand Patton and to require public apologies. He agreed that Patton should be monitored closely and that any similar incidents in the future should result in immediate removal. Churchill was not defending Patton's actions, but rather arguing that those actions, while serious, should not result in the loss of a valuable combat commander. Churchill also understood the political dimensions of the controversy in ways that some American leaders did not fully appreciate. He recognized that much of the outrage over the slapping incidents reflected broader American anxieties about the war, about casualties, and about the treatment of soldiers. He understood that Patton had become a symbol in a larger debate about military leadership and about whether aggressive commanders who got results should be held to the same standards as others. Churchill believed that this debate, while important, should not be allowed to override military necessity at a crucial point in the war. The contrast between Churchill's support for Patton and the attitudes of some other Allied commanders is revealing. Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded British forces alongside Patton in Sicily, had a very different view. Montgomery disliked Patton personally, considered him reckless and undisciplined, and believed the slapping incidents confirmed his assessment that American commanders lacked the professionalism of their British counterparts. Montgomery would have been happy to see Patton removed and replaced with someone he considered more controllable and more willing to defer to British strategic thinking. Other British generals shared Montgomery's skepticism about Patton. They found his theatrical personality off-putting, his aggressive tactics sometimes reckless, and his frequent conflicts with British commanders tiresome. Many British officers believed that Patton represented everything that was wrong with American military culture. Too much emphasis on individual initiative and aggressive action. Too little emphasis on careful planning and coordination. From this perspective, the slapping incidents were not aberrations, but rather symptoms of a broader problem with Patton's approach to command. Churchill, however, overruled these objections from his own military commanders. He understood that Montgomery and others were allowing personal dislike and professional rivalry to cloud their judgment about Patton's military value. Churchill recognized that Patton's aggressive style, while sometimes creating problems, was also a tremendous asset. The very qualities that made Patton difficult to work with, his impatience with caution, his insistence on rapid action, his willingness to take risks, were exactly what would be needed for the coming campaigns in France and Germany. Churchill's support for Patton also reflected his broader strategic thinking about the war. By late 1943, Churchill was increasingly concerned about Soviet power and about the post-war balance in Europe. He believed that the Western Allies needed to advance as rapidly as possible into Germany to ensure that Western forces, not Soviet forces, would occupy as much of Central Europe as possible. This strategic objective required aggressive commanders who would push forward rapidly rather than consolidating cautiously. Patton, whatever his personal flaws, was exactly the kind of commander who would drive deep into Germany given the opportunity. This strategic consideration was not explicitly stated in Churchill's public or even private communications about Patton, but it was certainly part of his thinking. Churchill was already looking beyond the immediate challenge of defeating Germany to the longer-term challenge of managing the post-war settlement. He believed that having commanders like Patton, who would advance aggressively and seize as much territory as possible, would strengthen the Western Allies' position in post-war negotiations with Stalin. The question of whether Churchill's support was decisive in saving Patton's career is difficult to answer definitively. Multiple factors contributed to the decision to retain Patton despite the scandal. Eisenhower's judgment that Patton was militarily indispensable was crucial. General Marshall's support, conveyed to Roosevelt and to Congress, was important. Roosevelt's own decision to back his military commanders rather than bow to public pressure was essential. But Churchill's support, coming from Britain's wartime leader and representing Allied consensus, provided important political cover and reinforced the arguments for retention. What is clear is that Churchill's backing was noticed and appreciated by American leaders. Eisenhower, in particular, was grateful for Churchill's support at a moment when he faced intense pressure over his decision to protect Patton. In later conversations and correspondence, Eisenhower acknowledged that Churchill's intervention had been helpful in managing the political fallout from the slapping scandal. Roosevelt also appreciated Churchill's support, which made it easier for him to resist congressional pressure to remove Patton. Churchill's support for Patton continued beyond the immediate crisis of the slapping scandal. When Patton was sidelined in the months following the incidents, kept out of the initial Normandy invasion, and used primarily as a decoy to mislead German intelligence about where the invasion would occur, Churchill argued that this punishment had gone on long enough. He believed that Patton should be returned to active command as soon as possible and should be given a significant role in the coming campaigns in France. In the spring of 1944, as planning for the Normandy invasion reached its final stages, Churchill again advocated for Patton's inclusion in a major command role. He argued that Patton should command one of the American army groups that would operate in France after the breakout from Normandy. Churchill's support helped overcome lingering reluctance among some American leaders, who worried that Patton might create new controversies or that his appointment would revive the slapping scandal in the press. When Patton finally returned to combat command in July 1944, leading the Third Army in its spectacular drive across France, Churchill followed his progress with great interest and satisfaction. Patton's rapid advance, his encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket, and his liberation of much of France vindicated Churchill's judgment that Patton was too valuable to lose. Churchill pointed to Patton's achievements as evidence that military decisions should be based on military capabilities rather than on political controversies or personal scandals. However, Churchill's support for Patton was tested again in the fall of 1944, when Patton made controversial statements about post-war Germany and about Soviet intentions. Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric and his suggestions that Germany should be rebuilt quickly as a bulwark against communism created diplomatic problems at a time when the alliance with the Soviet Union was still crucial for defeating Germany. Some British officials argued that Patton's political statements were becoming a liability and that he should be muzzled or removed. Churchill's response was nuanced. He agreed that Patton's political statements were unhelpful and that he should be instructed to avoid making public comments about post-war policy. But Churchill also privately sympathized with some of Patton's concerns about Soviet intentions. Churchill was himself becoming increasingly worried about Soviet power and about Stalin's post-war ambitions. While he could not publicly support Patton's anti-Soviet statements without damaging the alliance, Churchill understood the strategic thinking behind them and did not believe they justified removing Patton from command. The final test of Churchill's support for Patton came in the fall of 1945, after Germany's surrender, when Patton's statements about denazification policy created another major scandal. As military governor of Bavaria, Patton had argued that denazification policies were too harsh and that former Nazis should be allowed to remain in administrative positions to help rebuild Germany. He had compared Nazi Party membership to Democratic or Republican Party membership in the United States, suggesting it was politically irrelevant. These statements caused outrage and led to Patton's removal as military governor. By this point, Churchill was out of office, having lost the July 1945 election to Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. But Churchill's views on the Patton controversy were known. He believed that Patton had been politically naive and diplomatically clumsy, but that his basic instinct, that Germany needed to be rebuilt quickly and that excessive denazification would hinder this goal, was strategically sound. Churchill himself would make similar arguments in the coming years as the Cold War developed and as Western policy toward Germany shifted from punishment to reconstruction. Churchill's support for Patton throughout these various controversies reflected several consistent principles. First, Churchill believed that military commanders should be judged primarily on their military performance, not on their political views or personal conduct, unless those factors directly impaired their ability to command. Second, Churchill believed that winning the war required using the best available commanders, even when they were difficult or controversial. Third, Churchill believed that political leaders should support their military commanders against public pressure, unless there were compelling military reasons for removal. These principles were not unique to Churchill's relationship with Patton. Churchill applied similar thinking to his support for other controversial commanders, including Montgomery, despite his difficult personality, and various other British generals who created political or personal problems. Churchill understood that war required making pragmatic decisions that might be politically uncomfortable, but that were militarily necessary. However, Churchill's support for Patton was also shaped by his assessment of Patton's specific capabilities and by the strategic requirements of the campaigns in which Patton would fight. Churchill believed that the war in Western Europe required aggressive commanders who would push forward rapidly, who would take risks, and who would not be paralyzed by caution or by concern about casualties. Patton embodied these qualities more than any other Allied commander, and Churchill believed that losing him would significantly diminish Allied offensive capability. The relationship between Churchill and Patton, while never close personally, was characterized by mutual respect based on professional assessment. Churchill respected Patton's military abilities, even while finding his personality excessive. Patton respected Churchill's strategic vision and his willingness to make hard decisions, even while disagreeing with some British strategic priorities. Neither man allowed personal feelings to override their professional judgment about what was necessary to win the war. Churchill's support for Patton also reflected his understanding of coalition warfare and the importance of maintaining good relations with American military leaders. By supporting Eisenhower's decision to retain Patton, Churchill was supporting Eisenhower's authority as Supreme Allied Commander. By arguing that military decisions should be based on military considerations rather than political pressure, Churchill was defending a principle that protected all commanders, British and American, from having their decisions second-guessed by politicians responding to public opinion. The broader lesson from Churchill's support for Patton is about the challenges of leadership in wartime. Leaders must balance multiple competing considerations: military effectiveness, political acceptability, public opinion, alliance management, and personal judgment about character and capability. Churchill's decision to support Patton despite the slapping scandal and despite Patton's various other controversies reflected his judgment that military effectiveness had to take priority over other considerations at a crucial point in the war. Whether Churchill was right to support Patton is a question that historians continue to debate. Patton's military achievements in France and Germany were spectacular and vindicated Churchill's judgment that he was too valuable to lose. Patton's Third Army advanced farther and faster than any other Allied army, liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and inflicted more casualties on German forces than comparable units. From a purely military standpoint, retaining Patton was clearly the right decision. However, Patton's various scandals and controversies did create political problems that complicated alliance management and that distracted from military operations. His slapping of soldiers suffering from combat stress was a serious violation that damaged morale, and that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of psychological casualties. His political statements about the Soviet Union and about denazification policy created diplomatic problems at sensitive moments. Whether the military benefits of retaining Patton outweighed these political costs is a judgment that reasonable people can disagree about. What is clear is that Churchill's support for Patton was based on a clear-eyed assessment of military necessity rather than on personal friendship or on any illusions about Patton's character. Churchill understood Patton's flaws, but believed that his capabilities as a combat commander outweighed those flaws. Churchill was willing to defend this judgment publicly and privately, to provide political cover for American leaders who made similar assessments, and to argue that winning the war required making pragmatic decisions about personnel, even when those decisions were politically uncomfortable. In the final analysis, Churchill's secret backing of Patton when other generals wanted him removed reveals much about Churchill's approach to leadership and strategy. It shows his pragmatism, his willingness to make difficult decisions based on military necessity rather than political convenience. It shows his understanding of the importance of aggressive commanders in offensive operations. It shows his ability to separate personal feelings from professional judgment. And it shows his commitment to supporting the principle that military commanders should be judged primarily on their military performance rather than on political controversies or personal scandals. Churchill's support for Patton was one of many instances during World War II where Churchill made difficult decisions that balanced competing considerations and that required defending unpopular positions. His willingness to back Patton despite the slapping scandal and despite opposition from some British generals demonstrated the kind of moral courage and strategic thinking that characterized Churchill's wartime leadership. Whether one agrees with Churchill's judgment about Patton or not, the reasoning behind it and the principles it reflected offer valuable lessons about leadership, about coalition warfare, and about the difficult choices that leaders must make in wartime.